The book title is called Climate Change Education, Knowing, Doing, and Being. Tricia, also a geography educator, she works with her work focuses on pre-service geography teachers and how these influences shape their subject matter knowledge. And for me, I am primarily in social studies and civic education, although Tricia and I have collaborated together on a particular project that looked at teachers' knowledge of and understandings of the purpose of climate change education. So, as you can see, Claire her work focuses not only on knowledge, but also in terms of values and beliefs. Chu Hong focuses on children's knowledge of climate change education. Tricia and I have looked at teachers' understandings of the purpose of climate change education. So you can see it kind of like overlaps, but not, we don't work exactly in the same area. In addition, Claire, Tricia, and Chu Hong are very active in the IGU Commission for Geography Education. Tricia, myself, and Chu Hong are very active in the Southeast Asia Geography Association as well. So this grant opportunity gave us a perfect excuse to sit down together to think about what we really wanted to focus on and what we thought was going to be really important moving ahead. And we came up with the idea of focusing on trying to develop a protocol that would examine students' knowledge and beliefs about climate change. So I'm just going to provide just a brief overview of our presentation, then Tricia will take over and then Claire will wrap it up. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the introduction and purpose of the study. We will also talk a little bit about why we think it's important at this present point in time. We'll talk a little bit about our research questions and the results of our initial literature scan, and talk about how this actually has implications for our conceptualization of this particular survey protocol. And then we'll talk about some of the next steps that we hope to carry out. Oh, where is this? This one? Yeah. Okay. So we thought that we'll start off with a quote from this particular network. Well, basically our understanding is that education, while it's not a magic bullet, it is a necessary condition for because we think that even without educational interventions or adequate or effective educational interventions, even the most well thought out climate change policies may not necessarily succeed. So our idea was to come up with a research instrument that could be used around the world to assess what students know and believe about climate change. And we think that this is particularly important because of the increasingly contentious and contradictory political discourses around the causes, consequences, as well as the appropriate solutions to climate change. All right. Since we're in London, so we thought that we'll talk a little bit about the gap. However, the gap here focuses primarily on the gap in terms of literature. So we looked at previous work, and what we noticed is that many of the research studies actually focus a lot on knowledge gaps on the part of students. And separately, we noticed another set of studies that focus on students' attitudes and beliefs. We also noticed that these studies tended to be small scale or country specific, and many of these studies also focus primarily on environmental education rather than specifically on climate change. So these were some of the things that we identified as part of our literature scan. So since there's a gap, we'll try to close it. And we thought that we'll develop an international baseline study of students' knowledge and beliefs, largely because we noticed that attitudes towards and awareness of climate change varies enormously across many different contexts. Likewise, the level of participation in terms also varies significantly. In addition, we also noticed through our our initial literature scan that the curricula of different countries in terms of how they address the causes, the consequences of climate change also vary significantly. And there seems to be this lack of a multinational research that's focused specifically on climate change. So these are our research questions. The first research question focuses on knowledge. So what do students know about climate change? More specifically, what do they know about the science of climate change? What do they know about the management strategies for climate change? As well as what do they know about the debates within climate change? And our second research question will be what are students' beliefs about climate change? So in our study, we divided it into two main phases. So the first phase is that we thought that we'll focus on a literature scan to see what's out there. I referred to it slightly earlier. So we started this scan sometime in mid-September when we actually received the funds and we were able to get a research assistant involved in our project. So for phase one, we focus on literature that came from this list of countries. We looked at a fair number of studies out there, and we tried to cast on that as wide as possible. And based on this scan, as well as some of the work done by Chiu Huang earlier, we noticed that there was a clear pattern of knowledge gaps and misconceptions about climate change among students from different countries. So based on this, and drawing on some of this scan as well as some of the conclusions from other works, we moved on to phase two. And Tricia will take over.
So we're now at the stage in the project where we've looked at the scan, we've got some understanding of what type of literature or what kind of work exists. And we're trying to draw upon this now to craft our instrument. So right now, things are still quite hazy. We're trying to work through the fog, and hopefully, in a couple of months, there will be clarity and we can close the gap more successfully. But just based on the literature that Li Qing mentioned, a number of clear gaps or misconceptions came up. And we felt that we needed to categorize them. And these are some of the knowledge dimension categories that we've come up with at this stage of the project. The first would be, there are lots of misunderstandings about the causes of climate change, or the causes of global warming. And to us, this is very important, and I will talk a little bit more about how these knowledge dimensions will be incorporated into our research instrument. But right now, these are the gaps that we've identified, and I'm going to just talk very quickly about why these are important misconceptions or gaps that we need to find out about regarding whether students are unclear about climate change. So firstly, the causes of global warming, the types and relative contributions of greenhouse gases. There's a lot of misconceptions and confusion about which greenhouse gases contribute to climate change more significantly versus which of these greenhouse gases are more abundant within the atmosphere. This type of knowledge, all of these knowledge dimensions matter. And they matter because if students don't have a clear understanding of the science of climate change, then what happens is that the types of actions that they need to follow would also be flawed and would not really address the issues of climate change. So therefore, we felt it was very important because knowledge is a precondition, a necessary but not sufficient condition to developing environmental citizenship and stewardship for the environment. We wanted to really try to find out in our international baseline survey whether students actually had these misconceptions across the countries, or was it just in very small isolated studies. So if we had a broad picture of what students around the world actually knew or did not know, then it would have lots of implications for curricula that we develop for our countries. It would have implications for teacher education, how we work with our teachers, It would also have implications for all sorts of policy decisions as these students grow up and get more and more involved in organizations that work to remedy or address climate change. So we feel that it's really important at this point to know what students know or don't know across the world, and that's what we're trying to aim at with this particular project. So some of the knowledge dimensions that I mentioned: causes of global warming, types of and relative contribution of greenhouse gases. I'll talk about that a bit more. Mechanism and process of the greenhouse effect. Again, this is quite flawed. In some of the studies, we found that students think that there is a shield around here, and that this shield has somehow been broken into, it sounds like the ozone layer actually, and there's a big gap, and then all of this sunlight is coming in, and it's giving us cancer and causing acid rain. Yeah, and so what's happening here is that because students don't have a clear understanding of how the enhanced greenhouse effect is working, and they can't differentiate between how CFCs work within ozone depletion and or within global warming, as well as where these CFCs are working at within the atmosphere. Because of all of these knowledge gaps, all of these different problems, pollution, ozone depletion, greenhouse warming, they're all confused and wrongly connected in the minds of many students. So we were interested to find out, okay, so across all these different countries, what's the state of the art? What are our students actually thinking in Singapore, in the US, in Brazil, in Korea, in China? We really wanted to know this. So that would be the first. Second would be the distinction between climate change and global warming. This is a really iffy one that causes a lot of problems and actually makes something that is scientifically quite agreed upon already contentious in the eyes of many people. And that's because people are conflating very long-term changes in the world's temperature due to, variations in solar energy output, which causes the ice age, or even the 7-year solar flares and things like that. They're confusing all of that with global warming that's anthropogenic in nature. And because we also have periods of global cooling, we have periods where a volcano erupts and we have global dimming as a result of the increased pollution in the atmosphere, all of this then gets students to say, hang on a minute, temperatures aren't really going up, in a very clear and consistent trend, so therefore global warming's not really happening. And these green tree-hugging people, they're just making a lot of fuss over nothing, and that would then get them to question whether or not climate change is actually happening. So again, if we don't know whether students are clear about these distinctions, it would again be very hard for us to plan how we're going to address that in our curriculum, in our lessons, in our teacher education policies. Thirdly, the effects of climate change. Again, the effects are also are problematic because people think that with global warming there'll be more acid rain, or with global warming there'll be more ozone depletion. So because the effects are again mixed up with the causes, people then go on to read the signs of climate change, the signs as in the signs of climate change wrongly or erroneously. So for instance, this year it's a little bit hot. So yeah, definitely it's global warming. But no, last year we had an extremely cold winter, not in Singapore, we never have winter. But it's been a very cold winter, so how can this possibly be climate change? So they're mixing weather and climate up, they're not understanding long-term and short-term trends. So these are some of the issues that we drew from the literature, and we felt that our research instrument had to really try to capture these knowledge dimensions. Claire will go on to talk about the belief dimensions. I've just been tasked to talk about knowledge. Let's talk about what. Okay, we're at this point very hesitant to show you an example of the kind of question we might ask, because A, it opens us up to a lot of questions and potentially criticism at a point where we're still standing on quite shaky ground. But we'll take a leap of faith here. We'll assume, we'll caveat it that we're still in the stage where we're reading up, we're trying to find out more about the research instruments that have been used, and we're just really trying to put something together. So bear with me, there are conceptual, probably there are some issues and flaws, but we're working through them. So I think that, I'm not sure why this is here, but I think it was supposed to be an elaboration of the previous slide, but I've already done that, so maybe we'll skip this over. So these are the different types of questions that we wanted to look at. So if you, for instance, if we looked at the distinction between climate change and global warming, and students' misconceptions about the difference between these two, and the ability to tell the difference between weather and climate. So if this was a dimension we wanted to explore in our instrument, we thought we could ask a question like this. When we examine the Earth's climate history, what does climate change refer to? Global warming, global cooling, neither A nor B, both A and B. But it's not enough, I think, to just get students to choose one of these because they could guess. Or even if they got it right or wrong, we wouldn't know where exactly the misconception or problem lies. So we thought we would have then a second part question that says, the reason for my answer is, and then these would be some of the options that we would again draw from the literature. These are some of the misconceptions students have, and they would be included in some of the options, and then that would help us to understand whether or not students actually understood that climate change refers to both global warming and cooling, and why. So this is an example of the type of knowledge dimension question we would want to develop in our instrument, but we're not 100% committed. So similarly for the impact of climate change, we'll be asking questions related to the impacts on the different domains, the different ways in which geographers, because we're dominated by geographers approach the study of the Earth. And so that would be the physical systems, the hydrosphere. Claire says we need to get out of our geography speak and just use simple English. So hydrosphere would be, of course, water, and the atmosphere, the air, the cryosphere. I like that term, it makes me sound very high-tech, which is basically ice. The lithosphere, which is rocks and soil. So we ask questions about the impact of climate change on different spheres, and then also on the social cultural sphere. So for example, economies, how would climate change affect economies? Society and culture. I love the culture one because yesterday, because we're internationally networked and we come from very different cultures, we had some questions about culture, and to Claire, it would be football and beer, and to Li Qing and I, it would be about food. So how would football, beer, and culture, very high culture. So these would be some of the domains that we would be interested to explore. We will try to develop questions that would test students' understandings in each of these different domains, and our questions would probably be two-part, to test, first of all, what they know, and then to probe a little bit deeper into why they chose the option that they did. I think that Claire will go on now to the beliefs dimensions.
Thank you, Tricia. One of the things that we have identified through the research that we've looked at in relation to this is when current studies that are out there look at what young people know or believe about climate change, they tend to make some quite onerous connections between the two. So they tend to say things like, students have a lot of misconceptions about climate change, that's why they don't take any action. Or they tend to say things like, students know this and this about climate change, but they have these misconceptions, which is why they have climate change denial issues, or why they think they don't need to do anything about it. So one of the things that we thought was incredibly important for our survey to look at as well was not just what students know or don't know about climate change, but also what their beliefs were about climate change. But in focusing on beliefs, we were also really conscious that it's an incredibly tricky area, particularly with a kind of survey instrument to try and find out about. And so we didn't only look at the climate change literature here, but we also looked at other literature about students' attitudes and beliefs in other areas. And in particular, we focused on this international report here, which is actually about civics education, and it's about what is an enormous report, 38 countries, 140,000 students. And what it looks at is the relationship between civics knowledge, attitudes and values in terms of what lower secondary school students know. And we've taken our categorisation here partly from that report. They actually separate values and attitudes. We've put them together and I'll explain why. But also looking at behavioural intentions and behaviours. And whilst we were arguing yesterday about football, beer and food, we're also arguing about the correct spelling of the word behaviour. But as I'm doing this bit, we're doing it the English way. So in terms of values and attitudes, this categorisation is really useful for us because as we were reading through the literature, we found that a lot of the other research was highlighting aspects of what young people believe about climate change that we found, quite frankly, quite shocking. And we felt that it was important that our survey would take into account that previous work and also explore it in a further dimension. So in terms of values and attitudes, we've identified three main areas that we'd like to explore within there. One is about what their values and attitudes are about climate change. What the research tells us here is one of the key influences about what people believe about climate change is to do with how much they think it's going to have an impact on them and also on their friends and their others in their close community. And so that was one of the things that we wanted to explore, whether they felt that climate change would affect their own lives as they grow, but also if they feel that it would affect the neighbourhood that they live in, the community that they live in, and those kinds of things. So that was quite important focus for us. But also, one of the most surprising things that I found out of the literature is some of their values and attitudes about the causes and consequences to do with climate change. And I'll give you a really specific example here. One of the pieces of research that we looked at said that students' understanding about the relationship between the consequences of climate change and the causes of it have gone the wrong way round. So, for example, they think that if we save endangered species, like the panda, that will stop climate change. That they think by looking at the consequences of climate change and resolving those consequences, then actually the whole movement itself about climate change will be affected. So that was something we particularly wanted to focus on. In addition to that, one of the things that also came out of the research is the significance of young people's values and attitudes about the certainty of knowledge. And this is about whether they believe that science actually knows what's going on, and whether they believe that what we know now about climate change is the truth, or whether there is more to find out. And there's quite a sophisticated notion here of young people's views about epistemology, what they feel is actually known and what they feel is knowable. Now, we're quite aware that that's going to be incredibly difficult for us to find out, but we think it's really important that we try and assess what those young people do know about those things. And related to the certainty of knowledge, there are also enormous issues coming out of the literature about trust. And that's about trust of scientists, that scientists, A, might be able to find out the answer or the solution to climate change, that there's some kind of technical response to climate change that can help. But also trust that scientists are telling us what they know, that we can trust scientists and the work that they're doing, and that's actually related to what's going on. But a further dimension to the notion of trust is also the trust that young people have in politicians, and whether they believe that politicians can resolve climate change, whether they feel governments have the power to do something positive about it, and whether they think they will do something about it. And those are obviously quite pertinent issues as well, about how the values and attitudes towards what they should do about climate change is often affected by how comforted they feel about other people in society and what they can do about climate change as well. So those are one particular dimension that we wish to look at. In the international report, there are also two other dimensions that came through too. One was about behavioural intentions, and the other was about behaviours. Now, anybody who's joined a gym knows that there's a difference between our intended behaviour and our actual behaviour, what we hope we're going to do and actually what we do. But in terms of behavioural intentions, one of the key areas that's emerged from the literature is where they think responsibility lies. And that's in terms of whether they think they have a responsibility to do something in relation to climate change, but also whether they think there's any point to them doing something. So for example, is there any point me recycling when nobody else around me is recycling? Or is there any point for me as an individual or for my school to have a recycling programme when the government is throwing away lots of money on some coal-fired power station or something like that? So there's a sense here that behavioural intentions are related to their sense of responsibility, and that's not just about who is responsible to take some action, but what that responsibility involves. And that's a key area that we'd like to look at. And then also in terms of actual behaviours, one of the things that the literature has highlighted to us there is that it's not just about their own engagement with climate change, as to whether they think that climate change is an issue that they want to do something about, but also their values and attitudes about whether they have the agency to affect any change. And that would be the agency to affect change for themselves, so whether they have the capacity to initiate any change, but also whether they feel that their communities, their schools, corporate responsibility, state responsibility, where they have sufficient agency to actually change things as well. So what we're becoming increasingly aware of is that this is a really complex picture. And I'm not saying that we're regretting starting this, but we're absolutely aware of the enormity of the task ahead. Now what we've thought is that whilst we've separated out here for our purposes knowledge and beliefs, that as we come to construct our survey, we will actually start bringing these two together and combining them. And we've had a think about some of the different ways that we might do this, and we're aware that the way that we put our questions together in order to assess the belief dimensions will be very different to the way that we're assessing the knowledge dimensions. We've had some thoughts about that.
I'm sorry, you're mid-sentence, go on, I have a question.
No, I was just going to go on to the next slide, but if
Then I will. Are you using the theory of planned behavior? Because the variables seem to really dovetail with the theory of planned behavior.
we have talked about planned behaviour, and we have it on our to-do list. But to be perfectly honest with you, I don't think we know enough about it yet to be able to say whether that's something that we're going to be integrating into this or not. So it's a I don't know. Okay. So in relation to values and attitudes, so this is where in the initial report values and attitudes were separated. But here we're going to bring them together. But the distinction that we're making is that when people have fundamental beliefs about climate change, they tend to be pretty immovable. And whatever kind of education and whatever knowledge that you give people, these fundamental beliefs tend not to change. And that's something that we're aware of, and they tend to be much broader than attitudes. But attitudes themselves tend to be around those areas about responsibilities, the relationship between individuals and people. And I'll just add here that one of the things that we're aware of, and it's particularly a debate that's been very prominent here in England, has been about the criticism of climate change education, is that it focuses on the child and the child being responsible. So saying to the child, I'm exaggerating for effect, you must recycle, and you must reduce your consumption of energy, you must cycle to school, and placing the responsibility for climate change on the individual rather than reflecting the other strata of society and the responsibility they have for taking action towards climate change. So that's something, that criticism has been held, but that's something that we're quite interested in seeing if that's actually how young people feel. And we thought we might do it like this. By asking them, giving them statements, things like climate change is an important issue to me, I feel responsible, I think the government should do more, and asking them to rank these, to maybe look at them through a Likert scale, assess how much they agree with them, how much they feel that's the case. And that's the kind of sorts of questions that we're considering at the moment. Looking at behavioural intentions, what we intend to do there